The maid signed one word to his deaf mother, and the Mafia boss cancelled the wedding. What single word did the maid communicate to his mother? Why was it powerful enough to make the Mafia boss cancel his wedding? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to 7Tev Stories, where one gesture, one truth, or one unexpected revelation can change countless lives. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable episode. Thank you for every view, like, comment, and share. Your support means so much and helps 7Tev Stories continue bringing you powerful stories. Let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there right now. We are grateful to have you joining us today. Now, get comfortable, watch every detail carefully, and let us enter the beginning of this emotional story. He thought his wedding would unite two powerful families, but before the vows were spoken, one silent word from a maid would turn the whole room against the bride. Clara Bennett stood near the edge of the grand ballroom with a silver tray balanced carefully in both hands, her black uniform pressed smooth, her shoes polished, her face trained into the quiet expression every wealthy household seemed to prefer from a woman like her. Invisible, useful, silent. Above her, 10 crystal chandeliers poured warm light over the Romano estate, making the white roses glow like small moons and the gold-rimmed glasses sparkle across tables set for 200 guests. Outside, beyond the tall windows, Chicago wore a cold spring rain, but inside the mansion everything had been arranged to look perfect, expensive, untouchable. At the center of it all stood Madison Whitmore, the bride-to-be, wrapped in ivory satin and soft smiles, greeting senators, judges, bankers, and old family friends as if kindness had been stitched into her dress. Everyone seemed to believe it. Almost everyone. Clara watched the way Madison's smile changed whenever Vincent Romano turned his back. Vincent, tall and pale-skinned in a black tailored suit, moved through the room with the stillness of a man everyone noticed even when he said nothing. He was the kind of man people stepped aside for without being asked, the kind whose name made conversations lower by instinct. Tonight, he was not supposed to be the most feared man in the room. Tonight, he was supposed to be a groom. Beside the front row, in a carved wooden chair decorated with white ribbon, sat his mother, Eleanor Romano, small and elegant in a navy dress, her silver hair pinned neatly beneath a pearl clip. She watched the celebration with gentle eyes, reading lips when she could, following gestures when she could not. Years ago, an accident had taken most of her hearing, and since then, people had made the mistake of confusing silence with weakness. They spoke over her. Around her. Sometimes directly in front of her. Clara noticed because Clara had been raised by a deaf aunt who taught her early that hands could tell the truth long before mouths did. Across the room, Madison bent gracefully beside Eleanor, covering the older woman's hands with her own while a photographer lifted his camera. To the guests, it looked tender. A future daughter-in-law honoring the mother of the groom. But Clara was close enough to see Madison's fingers tighten just a little too hard, close enough to catch the impatience beneath the smile, close enough to feel something wrong gathering under the music. Eleanor looked up at Madison's lips, trying to read whatever sweet promise the young woman was performing for the room. Madison smiled wider, then glanced over her shoulder to make sure Vincent was still speaking with her father. Clara's hands tightened around the tray. In that tiny shift of the bride's eyes, in that polished little pause, the whole wedding seemed to hold its breath. The room kept laughing, the quartet kept playing, the champagne kept rising in delicate bubbles, but Clara Bennett felt the truth coming before anyone else did. And by the end of that night, every guest in that golden ballroom would learn that dignity does not need a voice to be heard. Vincent Romano had spent his life learning how to read rooms before they turned dangerous, but on his wedding day, the room was supposed to belong to someone else. It belonged to Madison Whitmore, with her bright smile, her polished family name, and her effortless way of making every guest feel as if they had been personally chosen to witness history. The Whitmores came from old money, the kind that wore charity pins to galas and spoke about kindness in front of cameras, while quietly measuring every person by what they owned, who they knew, and where they stood in the room. Madison's father, Richard Whitmore, shook hands near the marble fireplace as if the mansion already belonged to him. Her mother, Patricia, drifted from table to table in pale silk, complimenting the flowers, the music, the silverware, everything except the staff who carried it all. Clara Bennett knew that look. She had seen it in hotel ballrooms, private clubs, and penthouses overlooking Lake Michigan, the look that slid across her face without stopping, as if her body were part of the furniture. She had worked at the Romano estate for just under 4 months, long enough to know which floors creaked near the east hallway, which coffee Vincent preferred before sunrise, and which chair Eleanor liked moved closer to the window when the afternoon light came in. She had never asked questions. She had never entered rooms without permission. She had never raised her voice, even when the younger housekeepers whispered that a woman with her calm eyes must be hiding a whole lifetime behind them. They were right. Clara had been 12 years old when her Aunt Denise lost her hearing after a severe illness, and from that year on, Clara learned to speak with her hands at the kitchen table every night. Her aunt had taught her the alphabet first, then feelings, then prayers, then the kind of quiet warnings people need when the world refuses to slow down for them. To Clara, signing had never been a skill. It had been love. It had been survival. It had been the difference between leaving someone alone in silence and letting them know they still belonged. That was why she noticed Eleanor Romano on her first week at the estate. Other people saw Vincent's mother as fragile, a sweet older woman tucked safely into the background of a powerful family. Clara saw more. She saw how Eleanor studied. Reflections in windows when people spoke behind her. She saw how she counted footsteps by vibration on the wood floor. She saw how her smile sometimes arrived half a second late, not because she was confused, but because she was deciding whether to forgive another person for forgetting she was still present. During the wedding preparations, Clara had begun leaving small kindnesses near Eleanor without making a show of it, tea placed on the left side where she could see the steam, handwritten notes with clear letters, flowers turned toward the light instead of toward the guests. Eleanor noticed everything. Once, 3 days before the wedding, the older woman had caught Clara signing thank you to a delivery driver who was also deaf. Their eyes met across the foyer, and Eleanor's face changed. Not dramatically. Not enough for anyone else to see. But Clara saw it. A door opening. Since then, they had shared small words in passing: good morning, careful step, rain coming, beautiful flowers. Nothing that would disturb the household. Nothing that would invite attention. But attention was already coming. In the ballroom, as Madison laughed for another photograph, Clara watched Eleanor sit surrounded by noise she could not fully enter, and she felt the old ache rise in her chest. Some silences were peaceful. This one was not. The longer the afternoon stretched, the more the ballroom began to feel less like a wedding and more like a stage built to hide uncomfortable truths. Every flower had been chosen by a designer from New York. Every place card had been written in gold ink. Every candle had been measured so the flame would sit at the perfect height when the ceremony began at 6 o'clock. But no one had measured the distance between Eleanor Romano and the rest of the room. She sat only a few feet from the aisle, close enough to see the altar, close enough to smile when guests passed, and still somehow treated as if she were behind glass. People leaned toward her, exaggerated their words for one sentence, then gave up when she did not respond quickly enough. They patted her shoulder. They smiled too wide. Then they turned away and spoke normally to each other, relieved. To return to a world that did not require patience. Eleanor accepted it with the calm of a woman who had survived louder forms of loneliness. She kept her white-gloved hands folded over her purse, her eyes moving from face to face, gathering meaning from lips, posture, hesitation, and the little cruelties people thought silence would protect. Clara saw it all while moving between tables with water glasses and folded napkins. The bride's family occupied the front section as if it were their own private theater. Richard Whitmore pointed out the antique ceiling to 2 guests from Boston, speaking about the Romano estate with a strange sense of ownership. Patricia Whitmore inspected the seating chart and whispered that Eleanor should have been placed somewhere less visible, because cameras would be everywhere. Madison heard her mother and gave the smallest laugh, the kind that vanished as soon as Vincent came near. When he approached, she became softness itself. She touched his sleeve, tilted her face toward him, and asked whether his mother seemed comfortable. Vincent looked toward Eleanor, and for a moment the hardness around his eyes eased. Whatever the world thought of him, whatever name people whispered when he entered private rooms, he was still a son before that woman. He crossed the floor and bent near his mother, careful to stand where she could see his mouth. "Are you warm enough, Ma?" he asked. Eleanor read him, smiled, and signed back with slow graceful hands. "Handsome." "Nervous." Vincent gave the faintest smile, one that most guests would have missed. "Not nervous," he answered, though his eyes stayed on her face longer than his words needed. Eleanor lifted one eyebrow, unconvinced. Clara looked away before anyone could catch her watching something so private. That was when Madison's gaze landed on her. It was not anger yet. It was assessment. A cool, quick measurement of a maid standing too close to a family moment. Madison stepped beside Vincent and slid her hand through his arm, reclaiming the picture. Then she turned to Eleanor with a polished smile and spoke slowly, too slowly, as though speaking to a child. "We are going to take such good care of you. After today." The sentence looked beautiful to anyone watching. But Clara saw Eleanor's fingers tighten around her purse. She had read the words. She had understood the tone. And still, she smiled, because some women learn early that dignity often means swallowing pain without letting it stain their face. 5 minutes before the ceremony rehearsal, the first crack appeared behind the flowers. Clara had been sent to the west hallway with a linen basket, where extra napkins, ribbon, and emergency sewing supplies had been arranged on a long side table beneath framed portraits of the Romano family. The hallway was quieter than the ballroom, softened by thick carpet and closed doors, the kind of place where wealthy people stepped away from applause to become honest for a moment. Clara was replacing a stack of hand towels when she heard Madison's voice beyond the half-open door of the bridal sitting room. It was still sweet, still smooth, but without the sugar she used in public. "I am telling you, Mother, this cannot continue after tonight." Patricia answered in a careful whisper, the kind used by people who feared being overheard but not enough to stop talking. "Vincent adores Eleanor. You knew that before you agreed to this." Madison laughed once, low and sharp. "Adoration is one thing. Building our entire marriage around a woman who cannot even follow a dinner conversation is another." Clara froze with one hand still resting on the folded linen. The words moved through the quiet hallway like cold water under a door. Inside the room, fabric rustled, a zipper slid, a bracelet clicked against glass. Patricia sighed. "Be smart, darling. Do not fight him about his mother too soon." Madison's reply came faster this time, less controlled. "I will not spend the next 20 years acting like a nurse in my own home. After the honeymoon, we will suggest a private care facility. Somewhere tasteful. Somewhere discreet. Vincent will resist at first, but he listens when people make things look practical." Clara's breath shortened. She looked toward the ballroom, where music floated softly through the open archway, where Eleanor sat alone beneath chandeliers that made everything appear blessed. Madison continued, lower now, but every word still reached Clara. "A silent burden is still a burden, Mother." The linen slipped from Clara's fingers and landed without sound on the carpet. For a moment, she did not move. Her body knew what survival required. Pick up the towel. Finish the task. Walk away. People like Clara Bennett did not interrupt brides from families like the Whitmores. They did not carry other people's secrets into rooms filled with judges and bankers and men whose signatures could erase a life from comfort. She needed this position. Her rent was due in 6 days. Her younger brother in Milwaukee still counted on the money she sent every month. Her car had been making a strange noise for 2 weeks, and she had been praying it would last until summer. Silence was safer. Silence paid bills. Silence kept doors open. Then she saw her Aunt Denise in memory, seated at a small kitchen table in Atlanta, tapping Clara's wrist to get her attention before signing with tired but steady hands. When people talk around you like you are not there, they are not just stealing sound. They are stealing place. Clara closed her eyes. In the sitting room, Madison began practicing her smile again, asking whether her veil made her look innocent enough. Clara bent, picked up the linen, and placed it back on the table with careful hands. When she turned toward the ballroom, her face was calm. But something inside her had stopped obeying fear. Clara returned to the ballroom with the linen basket held close to her waist, moving carefully beneath the soft storm of voices. The music had changed to something brighter now, a string arrangement chosen to make wealth sound gentle. Guests were finding their seats for the rehearsal, laughing as if the whole day had been created for their comfort. No one looked at Clara long enough to notice that her hands were no longer trembling. That frightened her more than trembling would have. Fear was familiar. This stillness was new. She passed behind Eleanor and paused just long enough to place a fresh napkin beside the older woman's water glass. Eleanor looked up at her, and in that single glance Clara saw the same quiet intelligence she had admired from the beginning. Eleanor knew something had shifted. She did not know what, but she felt the air change around Clara the way a person feels rain before it reaches the skin. Clara wanted to sign everything right then. She wanted to bend down, take Eleanor's hands, and tell her that the woman about to join her family had already planned a future without her. But the room was full. Vincent was 20 feet away speaking with the officiant near the flower arch. Madison was stepping back into the ballroom with Patricia behind her, glowing again, spotless again, every cruel word hidden beneath makeup and satin. Clara lowered her eyes. Not here, she told herself. Not like this. A truth given at the wrong moment can be crushed before it reaches the person who needs it. She moved toward the service table and began arranging water glasses in perfect rows, 1 inch apart, because order was the only thing her hands could do while her mind raced. The house manager, Mrs. Alvarez, passed behind her and whispered, "You look pale. Take a breath before you drop something." Clara nodded without answering. She could not explain that she had just heard a future being quietly erased. Across the room, Madison laughed as Richard Whitmore raised a toast to family, loyalty, and beautiful new beginnings. The words floated over Eleanor like confetti. She smiled politely because she recognized enough of them to understand she was expected to smile. Clara felt the ache in her chest sharpen. It was not only what Madison had said. It was how easy the room made it for her to say it. People had built entire lives around pretending not to see the quiet person in the chair, the woman who had raised Vincent Romano, survived grief, survived illness, survived a world that kept lowering its expectations for her and calling it care. Then Madison lifted one finger toward Clara. Not a request. A summons. Clara picked up a tray of champagne flutes and crossed the polished floor. Madison did not look at her face. She looked at the tray, then at the front row, then back at the tray as if Clara herself were only the space between objects. "These need to be replaced," Madison said. Softly, smiling for the guests nearby. "The bubbles look flat." Clara knew they were not flat. They had been poured less than a minute ago. "Yes, ma'am," she said. Madison leaned closer, her perfume sweet and sharp. "And try not to hover near Vincent's mother. She gets confused easily, and I do not need staff making her more uncomfortable." Clara kept her face still. Behind Madison, Eleanor watched their mouths carefully, catching fragments, missing others, feeling the insult without receiving every word. Madison turned back to the guests with a shining smile. Clara stood there with the full tray in her hands, the gold light burning over the glass, and understood that the wedding had not begun yet, but the humiliation already had. Madison waited until Vincent stepped away with the officiant before she made the room look at Clara. It was done with almost nothing, a turn of the wrist, a little gasp, a champagne flute lifted too quickly from the tray. The glass tipped, pale bubbles sliding over the rim and splashing across the front of Clara's black uniform. It was cold enough to make her breath catch, but Clara did not move. She tightened her fingers around the tray, steadying the remaining glasses before they could fall. For one merciful second, she thought the moment might pass unnoticed. Then Madison placed a hand against her chest and widened her eyes as if she were the one who had been wronged. "Oh my goodness," she said, bright enough for the first 2 rows to hear. "Clara, please be careful. These dresses cost more than a month of your salary." A few guests turned. Then a few more. The music seemed to thin, not stopping, but losing warmth, the violins suddenly sounding far away. Clara felt the champagne soaking through the fabric against her skin. She could smell the sugar of it, sharp and expensive, mixing with Madison's perfume and the waxy sweetness of the white roses. "I am sorry, ma'am," Clara said, though both women knew she had not caused it. Madison's smile did not move. "I know today is exciting, but staff should not get distracted by family matters." She glanced toward Eleanor as she said it, and the sentence landed with 2 meanings, one for the guests and one for Clara alone. Patricia gave a soft little laugh behind her hand. Richard Whitmore looked over with faint irritation, not because Clara had been embarrassed, but because the embarrassment had disturbed the elegance of the room. A man in a navy suit murmured something about professionalism. Someone else looked away, relieved it was not their discomfort to fix. Clara lowered the tray to the service table with careful hands. Every instinct told her to apologize again, disappear into the kitchen, wipe the stain with cold water, and let the powerful protect their own lies. But Eleanor had seen enough. She leaned forward in her chair, eyes narrowed, reading the shape of Madison's mouth, the angle of Clara's shoulders, the false innocence hanging in the air. She did not know every word, but she knew cruelty when it entered a room wearing pearls. Madison turned toward Eleanor immediately, her performance softening into something almost angelic. "Oh, do not worry, Eleanor," she said slowly, kneeling beside her as cameras lifted again. "Just a little accident. Nothing for you to be concerned about." She spoke each word with exaggerated patience, her smile polished for the lens. Clara watched Eleanor's face, watched the older woman try to follow, watched the tiny flicker of humiliation appear and vanish before anyone else could name it. That flicker broke something in Clara more completely than the insult to herself. It was one thing to be treated as invisible. She had survived that in more rooms than she could count. It was another thing to watch a mother be handled like a decoration on her own son's wedding day. Vincent was still across the ballroom, unaware, his attention held by the final details of the ceremony. The officiant was pointing to the aisle. Leo Romano stood near the back wall, quiet and observant, but even he had not heard the words behind the bridal smile. Madison rose, brushed invisible dust from her satin skirt, and leaned close enough for Clara alone. "Learn your place before the vows begin," she whispered. Clara did not answer. She only looked past Madison to Eleanor, whose hands rested motionless in her lap, waiting for a world that rarely bothered to include her. The room kept glowing. The flowers kept shining. The guests kept pretending. And Clara Bennett finally understood that silence was not always humility. Sometimes silence was permission. The rehearsal began with everyone standing in places chosen by a planner who measured beauty down to the inch. The aisle ran between rows of white roses and gold chairs, ending beneath an arch wrapped in silk and baby's breath. Vincent stood at the front with his hands folded, his pale face unreadable, his black suit making him look more like a verdict than a groom. Madison took her place across from him, radiant beneath the chandelier light, and the room adjusted itself around her glow. Guests leaned forward. Phones lifted discreetly. The Whitmores smiled as if they had arranged not only a marriage, but a coronation. Clara stood near the service entrance with a damp towel pressed against the champagne stain on her uniform, watching from the edge of the world. She should have gone to the kitchen. Mrs. Alvarez had already motioned for her to step away and clean herself properly. But Clara could not leave Eleanor alone in that front row, not after what she had heard, not after what she had seen. The officiant cleared his throat and asked the family to practice the blessing before the vows. It was a simple tradition, he explained, a moment for the mothers to offer their love to the couple. Patricia Whitmore rose first, elegant and dry-eyed, placing both hands over her heart as she spoke about destiny, legacy, and two families becoming one. Her words flowed easily, polished smooth by a lifetime of saying the right thing in public. The guests sighed. Madison lowered her lashes at the perfect moment. Then the officiant turned gently toward Eleanor, and a small uncertainty moved through the room. Eleanor did not hear him. She was watching Vincent, waiting for direction. Vincent stepped toward her at once, bending so she could read his lips. "Ma, they want you to bless us." Eleanor's face softened. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded card. Clara saw the careful handwriting on it, each line prepared in advance, probably written slowly at a kitchen table under a lamp. Vincent helped her stand. The room became quiet, though not patient. "There is a difference." Eleanor looked at the card, then at Madison, then at her son. Her voice came out soft and uneven, shaped by years of not hearing herself clearly. "I wish you a home where no one is made small." The sentence was simple, but it entered the room with more grace than all the flowers combined. Vincent looked down, visibly moved. Clara swallowed hard. Madison smiled, but only with her mouth. When Eleanor continued, searching carefully for each word, Madison's fingers tightened around her bouquet. "I wish you patience when love is quiet," Eleanor said. "I wish you kindness when life changes." A woman in the second row shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. Richard checked his watch. The room had no trouble listening to speeches about money and legacy, but an older deaf woman speaking slowly seemed to cost them more than they wanted to give. Madison stepped forward before Eleanor could finish the last line. "That was beautiful," she said brightly, placing a hand on Eleanor's arm and guiding her back toward the chair before the blessing was done. "So beautiful. We do not want you to tire yourself out." The guests smiled with relief, grateful for the rescue they did not know was an insult. Eleanor sat, her unfinished card still in her hand. Vincent's eyes narrowed slightly, but Madison turned to him with such practiced tenderness that the moment almost disappeared. Almost. Clara saw Eleanor fold the card once, then again, smaller and smaller, until the blessing became a square hidden in her palm. Something in Clara's chest went still. Madison had not only planned to remove Eleanor later. She had begun doing it already, in front of everyone, one gentle interruption at a time. Clara set the towel down. Her uniform was still stained. Her job was still fragile. Her future was still uncertain. But Eleanor's words echoed inside her like a bell no one else could hear. A home where no one is made small. Clara looked at Madison's perfect smile, then at the folded card trapped in Eleanor's hand, and for the first time that day, she stepped away from the wall. Clara crossed the edge of the ballroom as if the floor had grown longer beneath her feet. No one stopped her at first, because no one truly saw her. To the guests, she was only a moving piece of the service, a dark uniform against gold chairs and white roses, a pair of careful hands meant to refill glasses, straighten napkins, and vanish before she became part of anyone's memory. But Eleanor saw her. The older woman's eyes lifted from the folded blessing card, and for one brief second, the loneliness in them disappeared beneath recognition. Clara paused beside the first row, close enough for Eleanor to read her face, but not close enough to draw Madison's attention yet. "Are you all right?" Clara wanted to sign, but she did not. The question was too small for what had just happened. Instead, she reached for the water glass beside Eleanor and adjusted it slightly, giving herself a reason to be there. Vincent noticed the movement, but before he could speak, Madison stepped forward with a soft laugh that pulled the room back toward her. "Let us try that part again," she said to the officiant. "I think everyone deserves to see how much this family means to me." Her voice was sweet, warm, perfectly placed. It floated across the ballroom like honey poured over cracked glass. Patricia smiled proudly. Richard nodded as if Madison had just saved the mood from becoming inconvenient. The officiant, relieved to have direction, invited her to stand beside Eleanor for a photograph before the ceremony continued. Madison turned with graceful urgency, gathering her satin skirt in one hand, and knelt beside Vincent's mother as two photographers moved closer. The lights flashed once, then again. Madison took Eleanor's hands between her own, arranging them in a way that looked tender from a distance. Clara was close enough to see Eleanor flinch slightly at the pressure. Madison leaned in, making sure Vincent could see her face, making sure the cameras could catch the angle of devotion. "Eleanor," she said slowly, shaping every word too carefully, "I want you to know that after today, you will always have a place with us." The room softened. A few guests smiled. Someone whispered that Madison was an angel. Vincent watched. Without blinking, and for a moment Clara saw the fragile hope cross his face, the hope of a son who wanted to believe he had chosen a woman capable of loving the person who had given him everything. Madison continued, even sweeter now. "I will care for you like my own mother. You will never feel alone in our home." Eleanor read the words, and because she was kind, because she had spent years accepting small portions of love and calling them enough, her eyes filled with cautious gratitude. She lifted one shaking hand toward Madison's cheek, not quite touching it, a gesture of blessing offered to a woman who did not deserve it. Clara felt the room tilt around her. The lie was no longer hidden in a hallway. It was standing under chandeliers, wearing satin, holding an old woman's hands, asking to be admired. Madison's thumb moved over Eleanor's glove in a slow, possessive stroke, and her smile remained flawless. But her eyes shifted, just once, toward Clara. It was a warning. Stay small. Stay silent. Stay in your place. Clara looked at Eleanor, then at Vincent, then at the folded blessing card still trapped in the older woman's lap. She heard her aunt's hands in memory, tapping the kitchen table with gentle force. Do not let them steal her place. The photographers lowered their cameras. The officiant prepared to move on. Madison began to stand. And Clara stepped closer. Clara stepped into a silence that did not exist yet, carrying nothing in her hands except the truth. Madison had just begun to rise from beside Eleanor's chair when Clara moved between the bride and the cameras with a quietness so steady that the guests needed a moment to understand she was no longer serving them. Her stained uniform caught the chandelier light where the champagne had dried into a pale mark across her chest, but Clara did not lower her eyes. Madison's smile held for half a second, then tightened at the edges. "Clara," she said softly, but the softness was not kindness. It was a warning wrapped in silk. "The staff area is behind the ballroom." Clara heard her. Everyone heard her. But Clara was looking only at Eleanor. The older woman's face lifted slowly, confusion and hope passing through. Her eyes like shadows crossing water. Clara raised one hand, not high, not dramatic, just enough for Eleanor to see clearly. Vincent's attention sharpened at once. He had seen many things in rooms full of powerful people, false smiles, hidden bargains, friendly voices carrying sharp intentions, but this was different. This was a maid standing in the center of his wedding rehearsal, calm as a prayer, about to risk everything in front of 2 families and 200 guests. Clara's fingers moved. One word. Liar. Eleanor's entire body went still. The word did not travel through air. It did not disturb the violins. It did not need sound to strike the room. It landed directly where Madison's performance had been aimed, in the private world where Eleanor had spent years trying to understand people who rarely cared enough to be understood. Her gloved hands tightened around the folded blessing card. Her eyes moved from Clara to Madison, and the softness in them changed. Not into anger at first. Into recognition. Madison's face lost its color so quickly that Patricia reached toward her elbow. "What was that?" Madison asked, too loudly. "What did she just do?" Clara lowered her hands, her heart pounding so hard she felt it in her throat. For a moment, no one moved. A photographer glanced at his camera as if the answer might be trapped inside the last picture. The officiant looked between the women, unsure whether to smile or step away. Richard Whitmore straightened, annoyance beginning to harden his features. Vincent took one step forward. The sound of his shoe against the marble floor was small, but it made every whisper stop. "Clara," he said, his voice low and controlled. "What did you sign to my mother?" The room seemed to narrow around her. Clara felt Madison stare like heat against the side of her face. She felt Mrs. Alvarez watching from the service entrance, fear and warning in her eyes. She felt every rule of survival pulling at her sleeves, telling her it was not too late to apologize, to say it was a misunderstanding, to return to the kitchen and become invisible again. But Eleanor was looking at her now with both hands lifted slightly from her lap, asking without sound for the rest of the truth. Clara swallowed. Before she could answer, Madison laughed once, sharp enough to crack the polished air. "Vincent, please. She is embarrassed because she spilled champagne, and now she is trying to make a scene. You know how staff can get when they want attention." The sentence floated there, ugly beneath all that beauty. Vincent did not look at Madison. His eyes stayed on Clara. "Again," he said. "Sign it again." Clara looked at Vincent, then at Eleanor, and for the first time since she had entered the Romano estate 4 months earlier, she did not ask permission to be understood. She lifted both hands slowly, making each motion clear enough for Eleanor to see and careful enough for the room to feel the weight of what it could not hear. "Liar." The word appeared again in the space between them, quiet and exact. Eleanor closed her eyes for one brief second, not from confusion, but from the pain of knowing her heart had understood before her mind was ready to accept it. Madison stepped forward, her satin skirt whispering over the marble. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising just enough to sound wounded. "Vincent, she is manipulating your mother. She probably learned a few signs online and thought it would be dramatic." Clara did not flinch, but the insult pressed against every old bruise the world had left on her. Before she could respond, Eleanor lifted her hand. It trembled at first, then steadied. Her fingers moved toward Vincent, slow and deliberate. "Listen with your eyes." Vincent froze. The words were not spoken, but they struck him harder than any accusation could have. That phrase belonged to a private room years ago, to hospital walls, to his mother waking after the accident that changed her life, terrified because the world had gone quiet. He had been young then, frightened in a way he never admitted, holding her hand while a therapist taught them their first signs. Listen with your eyes had become their promise. When sound fails, love pays attention. Vincent turned fully toward his mother, and the ballroom seemed to shrink around them. "What is she telling you, Ma?" he asked, shaping the words carefully. Eleanor looked at Clara and signed something back, her expression no longer fragile. "Tell me everything." Clara felt the entire room waiting for her to either break or disappear. She did neither. She signed first to Eleanor, then spoke aloud for Vincent and the guests, her voice quiet but steady. "I heard Miss Whitmore in the west hallway before the rehearsal. She said after the honeymoon, she would suggest a private care facility. Somewhere outside the city. Somewhere discreet." Madison gasped, but Clara continued before fear could close her throat. "She said she would not spend her marriage acting like a nurse. She said your mother was a silent burden. The room changed temperature. Not literally, but everyone felt it. A coldness moved from the front row to the back, passing over silk dresses, polished shoes, pearl earrings, and champagne glasses that no one wanted to lift anymore. Richard Whitmore's face tightened. Patricia's lips parted, but no words came out. Madison shook her head with a laugh too thin to convince anyone. She is lying. She is a maid, Vincent. She wants sympathy. She wants money. Maybe she wants revenge because I corrected her behavior. Vincent finally looked at his bride. There was no anger on his face yet, and somehow that was worse. It was the stillness of a man measuring a bridge before deciding whether to burn it. Leo, he said without turning around. Check the hallway system. Leo Romano, who had been standing near the back wall with his hands folded, moved at once toward a side console used by the event security team. Madison's smile vanished completely. Vincent saw it. Eleanor saw it. Clara saw it too, and in that silent collapse of Madison's performance, the truth began to breathe. Leo crossed to the security console near the side entrance, and every step he took sounded louder than the music had all afternoon. The quartet had stopped without being told. The guests seemed to notice only after the silence had already settled over them, heavy and complete, pressing against the chandeliers, the flowers, the untouched champagne. Madison stood beneath the arch with her bouquet lowered at her side, no longer looking like a bride in control of a perfect day. She looked like someone counting the seconds before a locked door opened. Vincent did not move toward the console. He stayed beside Eleanor, close enough for his mother to see his face, close enough for Clara to notice how carefully he was holding himself together. Men like Vincent Romano did not need to raise their voices to make a room obey. They only needed to become quiet in a certain way. Richard Whitmore stepped forward with a strained smile, trying to turn power back into politeness. Vincent, let us be reasonable. Weddings are emotional. Staff misunderstand things. Young women exaggerate when they feel embarrassed. Clara felt the words touch the room and slide toward her, trying to reduce her into something small again. Staff. Young women. Embarrassed. Not a witness. Not a person. Not someone whose truth deserved weight. Before Vincent could answer, Eleanor lifted her hand, and the movement stopped Richard more effectively than any command. She signed slowly, her eyes fixed on her son. Do not let them speak over her. Vincent read the signs, then turned his head toward Richard. My mother has asked you to stop talking. Richard's face flushed, but he closed his mouth. Across the room, Patricia gripped the back of a chair. Madison tried to recover her smile, but there was nowhere left for it to stand. Leo touched the screen, rewound the hallway feed, and connected the audio to the ballroom speakers. A soft crackle filled the room. Then came Madison's voice from minutes earlier, smooth, private, certain she had been safe behind a half-open door. I will not spend the next 20 years acting like a nurse in my own home. A few guests inhaled sharply. Madison went completely still. The recording continued, merciless not because it was loud, but because it was exact. After the honeymoon, we will suggest a private care facility. Somewhere tasteful. Somewhere discreet. Vincent's gaze never left Madison. Clara looked at Eleanor, and what she saw broke her heart more than tears would have. Eleanor was not crying. She was listening with her eyes to the faces around her, watching people understand in seconds what she had been forced to feel in fragments. Then the final sentence came through the speakers, clear enough to reach the back wall. A silent burden is still a burden, mother. No one moved. The word seemed to hang above the aisle, uglier than any stain, heavier than any secret. Madison's bouquet slipped slightly in her hand, white petals brushing against her dress. She looked at Vincent first, then at the guests, then at Clara, and the hatred that flashed across her face lasted only a second before fear covered it. "Vincent," she whispered, "I was upset. I did not mean it like that." Eleanor stood before he could reply. Her knees were not as steady as they had once been, but her dignity needed no support. Clara instinctively stepped closer, not touching her, only near enough to help if asked. Eleanor raised both hands and signed to Clara first. "Thank you for telling me the truth." Clara's throat tightened. Then Eleanor turned to Vincent and signed with slow, painful grace. She heard what love refused to say. Vincent's expression changed. The sun disappeared behind the groom for only a moment, then both disappeared behind something colder and clearer. The entire ballroom understood at once that the wedding had already ended, even before he said a word. Vincent turned toward Madison, and the silence followed him like a shadow. For a moment, he did not look like a man standing at the edge of marriage. He looked like a son standing between his mother and every room that had ever made her feel small. Madison tried to step closer, but the movement died beneath his stare. "Vincent, please," she said, her voice thin now, stripped of satin and ceremony. "I was overwhelmed. People say things before weddings. I was scared." "Scared of what?" Vincent asked quietly, "of caring for the woman who raised me, or of everyone finding out you never intended to try?" Madison's mouth opened, but no polished answer came. The guests watched as if breathing too loudly might make them responsible for what they had ignored. Richard Whitmore moved again, this time with his hands raised in a careful gesture of peace. "This does not need to become a public embarrassment. Families handle misunderstandings privately." Vincent looked at him then, and the older man stopped mid-breath. "Public embarrassment," Vincent repeated. "You mean the kind Clara was expected to swallow when your daughter spilled champagne on her and called it carelessness? You mean the kind my mother was expected to swallow when your daughter interrupted her blessing and called it concern? You mean the kind everyone in this room was comfortable watching until the truth had a recording?" Richard's face hardened, but he had no room left to stand tall. Patricia lowered her eyes. Madison clutched her bouquet with both hands, the white flowers bending under the pressure. She looked toward Eleanor, perhaps hoping for mercy, perhaps hoping the older woman's kindness would once again be mistaken for permission. Eleanor did not look away. She lifted her chin, her silver hair catching the light, her gloved hands steady at her sides. Vincent stepped to the small table beside the arch, where two velvet ring boxes waited beneath a spray of white orchids. He picked up the groom's ring, held it for a second, then placed it back down with a sound so small that somehow everyone heard it. "There will be no wedding," he said. Madison let out a soft, stunned breath. "Vincent, you cannot do this. Not here. Not in front of everyone." He looked at the rows of guests, the cameras, the flowers, the gold chairs, the entire theater built to bless a lie. "Here is exactly where it needs to happen." Then he turned back to her. "You did not fail as a bride. You failed as a human being." The words did not echo. They settled. Madison's face crumpled, but the room had already changed its allegiance. The same people who had smiled at her performance now stared at the marble floor, ashamed of how easily beauty had fooled them. The officiant closed his book. The photographers lowered their cameras. One by one, the guests stopped pretending there might still be a ceremony to save. Vincent looked toward Leo and gave a single nod. Leo opened the side doors, not with force, but with finality. The message was clear. The Whitmores and their guests could leave with their jewelry, their status, and their explanations, but they could not leave with the Romano name. Madison stood under the arch a moment longer, surrounded by flowers meant for vows she would never speak. Then Patricia took her arm, Richard gathered what remained of his pride, and the three of them walked down the aisle in the wrong direction. No music played. No one applauded. As they passed Clara, Madison's eyes flickered with one last accusation, but Clara did not lower her gaze this time. She stood beside Eleanor, stained uniform and all, and let the bride walk past the truth she had tried to bury. Only when the doors closed did Vincent turn back to his mother. His face softened, not for the room, not for power, but for her alone. Eleanor reached for him, and he took her hands the way he had as a boy, carefully, fully, listening with his eyes. For several seconds after the doors closed, no one knew what to do with the quiet. The ballroom that had been built for applause now held something heavier, something honest. White roses still climbed the arch, candles still burned along the aisle. Champagne still waited in crystal glasses no one wanted anymore. But the celebration had lost its mask, and every person left inside could feel the difference. Vincent stood with Eleanor's hands in his thumbs resting gently over her gloves, his eyes fixed on her face so she would not have to search for him in the silence. "I am sorry, Ma," he said carefully, shaping each word for her. "I should have seen it sooner." Eleanor watched his mouth, then lifted one hand from his and touched his cheek. Her fingers trembled, but not from weakness. She signed slowly. "You saw it when it mattered." Vincent's jaw tightened, and for the first time that day, the dangerous stillness left him. What remained was grief, love, and the small broken look of a son who had almost given his mother a home where she would have been tolerated instead of cherished. Clara stood a few feet away, suddenly aware of the champagne stain on her uniform, the eyes on her face, the impossible fact that she was still in the center of a room where people like her were never meant to stand for long. Mrs. Alvarez approached quietly, holding a clean white towel, but before Clara could take it, Eleanor reached for her. Not with command. With gratitude. Clara stepped closer. Eleanor took both of Clara's hands in her own and signed one word. Home. Clara felt the word move through her like warmth after a long winter. She signed back before she could stop herself. Safe. Eleanor's eyes shone then, not with helplessness, but with recognition. Two women from different worlds, one seated beneath a family name carved in stone, one standing in a stained uniform, had found each other in a language the room had ignored until it became the only language that mattered. Vincent watched them, and something in his expression changed again. He turned toward the remaining guests, many of whom suddenly looked ashamed of their flowers, their diamonds, their silence. "My mother will finish her blessing," he said. No one moved. Then Vincent guided Eleanor back to the center beneath the arch, not as a symbol, not as a decoration, but as the woman whose words should have never been interrupted. Clara stood beside her, not touching unless needed, close enough to help, far enough to honor her strength. Eleanor unfolded the small card she had crushed in her palm. The paper was creased now, but the handwriting remained clear. Her voice came softly, unevenly, beautifully. "I wish every home to be a place where no one is made small." This time, nobody coughed. Nobody checked a watch. Nobody looked away. Vincent kept his eyes on his mother. Clara kept her hands ready in case Eleanor wanted to sign what speech could not carry. When the blessing ended, the silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt like respect arriving late, but finally arriving. Vincent turned to Clara then, his voice lower, gentler than anyone in that room expected from him. "Miss Bennet, you protected my mother when people with more power chose comfort over courage." Clara shook her head slightly. "I only told her what she deserved to know." Vincent looked at the stained uniform, the steady eyes, the hands that had risked a livelihood for a stranger's dignity. "No," he said. "You reminded this room what respect looks like." Outside, the rain had stopped against the tall windows, leaving the city washed silver under the evening light. Inside, the white flowers remained, but they no longer belonged to a wedding. They belonged to a reckoning. And that day, everyone in the Romano ballroom learned that dignity does not need a voice to be heard.